Holocaust survivors are preparing to gather at Auschwitz to mark 75 years since the liberation of the concentration camp. In fact, it was on this day, 75 years ago, that people were able to flee what was a murderous hell. Joining me now, Johnny Weiss, the son of a Holocaust survivor who is now living in Sydney. Johnny, thank you so much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it. First of all, before we get to Lottie, your mum, I'd like to ask you, what is the significance of 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz today?
Thanks, Pete. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. The significance is particularly important in today's climate. Something terrible and very, very seriously appalling happened 75 years ago, and the significance is not just remembering those circumstances, but being on the lookout today for similar developments, similar trends in societies all around the world, and always trying to ensure that it will never happen again.
Johnny, how did your mother come to be in Auschwitz?
Well, Pete, as the Germans started to take over significant parts of Europe, they came to Czechoslovakia, where my mother and late father resided, and they started to take from Czechoslovakia at the time, now Slovakia, the city of Bratislava. Firstly, young people. The Jews were rounded up. As you know, we were identified totally only because of our religion for extermination by the Nazis. And so by the time they got to Bratislava, where my mother had 8 in her family, she and 2 of her sisters were taken away as to be among the first to go to Auschwitz.
What sort of stories, Johnny, did Lottie tell you when you were growing up? How did she describe the kind of horrors that went on in Auschwitz?
Peter, it is very difficult to describe in our terms, in our society, to try and understand the graphic horror of what my mother saw. I'm privileged that today, exactly on this day, my brother and one of his sons is at Auschwitz today, literally today, reliving her footsteps. Her stories were those of brutality, of terror, of great fear, of starvation, of cold and of hot. And as we grew up as young children, we came to understand the real meaning of words that, like cold, like starvation, like terror, that we use quite loosely today. But she faced all of those, and somehow, through a range of miracles, survived.
I got to say, Johnny, and I'm sure you've been there too, I was there at Auschwitz about 5 years ago for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and it's one of the most devastating places I've ever been. And some of the stories, one of them being that in the cold, in the middle of winter, some of the prisoners would be stripped naked and forced to stand out in the snow, and if that wasn't already cold enough, the guards, the Germans, would then throw water on them, you know, to make them even colder, to basically freeze them. That's the sort of stuff that Lottie might have told you about, I'm sure.
Pete, that and significantly more.
Yeah.
You know, those who go to Auschwitz today see buildings, but they do not see the terror of what humanity can do to humanity. And what you've described is just part of those who were taken through a blink of an eye, looking one way or looking another way. Was the choice, not the choice, the choice imposed on them of life or death. And our mother survived many such miracles, of literally being number 21 when 20 girls were taken away, of stopping when she was about to electrocute herself. She went through enormous pain. She saw her family disappear. She saw girls taken out of those lines and just shot. She was on the death march. Again, people just taken out and slaughtered for no more than they were Jewish people.
Gives me goosebumps hearing those stories, Johnny. She was 21 of a group of 20, and the other 20 were killed. Just extraordinary stuff. And I should mention, obviously mine was a small part, the story that I was able to relay, but yeah, there was the mass extermination of millions of Jews that were there as well. Johnny, having been there to Auschwitz, what's it like for you to be the son of a survivor? You know, how powerful is that for you?
Well, Pete, we were lucky. I mean, my brother and myself, many survivors all came out with their own stories, some with total trauma, some with guilt. Why did they survive and other members of their family didn't? Some that never talked about it, some that hid it from their children to protect them, some who hid it from themselves not to repeat the terror. We were very fortunate. Our mother was one of 8. She lost the other 7, her parents and brothers and sisters. And she wondered how, after 3 years, did she survive and the others? What was the point? Where to, who even cared or knew if she was alive or dead? And she finally rationalized to say, I was spared to tell the story of those who can't tell it anymore. And she became a wonderful volunteer guide at the Jewish Museum for 25 years. She spoke to many schools. She's an incredible inspiration of how life is fragile, how life is just between a blink or a pointed finger, and how every moment should be treasured, should be embraced, the awesomeness of life, but the fragility of life.
Johnny Weiss, your mum, Lottie, spot on. Life is so fragile, as we are seeing with another breaking story that's taking place today. But Johnny, really appreciate your time and sharing your stories, and I should point out that if people want to learn more about this, then they can go to the Sydney Jewish Museum and learn more about the survival stories of Jewish people who came to Australia afterwards once Auschwitz was liberated again today, 75 years ago.
And Pete, I just want to share on behalf of all of us, thank you and your colleagues in the media for making sure that we don't forget and we remain alert. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Johnny Weiss, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.